Picture this. You're standing in a shallow valley somewhere in what is now East Africa, 60,000 years ago, and the sky just turned the color of a bruise. There's no phone to check the forecast, no roof over your head, no jacket hanging by the door. Just you, a handful of family members, and a wall of clouds rolling in like the world's angriest blanket. What do? Do you panic? Do you just stand there and let the sky do what it wants? Believe it or not, the answer says a lot about how we became the species that eventually built umbrellas, raincoats, and those little plastic ponchos they sell for $4 at theme parks right before a storm hits. Ancient humans didn't have any of that. What they had was instinct, community, and an impressive amount of improvisation. So stick around, because we're about to soak ourselves in one of the most overlooked parts of ancient life. What happened when the rain started falling and there was nowhere fancy to run? Let's set the scene properly. Ancient humans spent the overwhelming majority of their existence outdoors. We're talking hundreds of thousands of years of open sky living before anyone thought to nail together four walls and call it a house. Rain wasn't an inconvenience that ruined a barbecue. It was a recurring, sometimes violent, occasionally deadly event that could soak your only fire, spoil your food, flood your sleeping spot, and turn solid ground into a slippery nightmare. And yet, humanity survived every single downpour for millions of years. So the question isn't really whether ancient people got wet. Of course they got wet. The real question is how they turned getting wet into something survivable, and sometimes even something oddly useful. The first thing to understand is that ancient humans were master pattern readers long before they were tool makers or fire starters. Long-term survival meant paying obsessive attention to the sky. Certain cloud formations, sudden drops in temperature, unusual animal behavior, the smell of moisture in the air, all of these became early warning signs. Birds flying low, insects going quiet, herds of grazing animals suddenly moving toward higher ground. Ancient communities learned to read these signals the way we read a weather app notification, except theirs came with real consequences if ignored. Miss the signs, and you could end up caught in the open during a flash flood. Catch the signs early and you had time to prepare. Preparation usually meant one thing above all else: shelter. Now, don't picture some cozy log cabin situation. Ancient shelter was often whatever nature had already built for free. Caves, rock overhangs, dense tree canopies, hollowed-out logs, thick clusters of shrubs. Anything that offered a break from falling water was fair game. Caves in particular were prime real estate, and not just because they kept the rain off. They also blocked wind, retained a bit of warmth, and provided a defensible space against predators who were equally eager to get out of the storm. Yes, that's right. You might be sharing your dry little pocket of rock with something that also wanted shelter, and negotiations over who got to stay were not exactly diplomatic. If no cave was nearby, ancient humans became remarkably resourceful builders on short notice. Large leaves, bark sheets, animal hides, and woven branches were assembled into makeshift lean-tos. Some groups used mammoth bones and tusks as structural supports for shelters, layering hides over the frame to create something that was part tent, part small fortress. Excavated sites in parts of Eastern Europe have revealed dwellings built almost entirely from mammoth remains, a design choice that says a lot about creativity when your only lumberyard is a dead animal. These structures weren't waterproof in the way we imagine today, but they were enough to reduce direct exposure, break the wind, and give a family a fighting chance at staying reasonably dry. Fire was the second pillar of surviving a downpour, and keeping it alive during heavy rain was basically an extreme sport. A wet fire is a dead fire, and a dead fire during a storm could mean no warmth, no cooked food, no protection from nocturnal predators, and no light to see anything coming. So ancient communities developed surprisingly clever techniques to keep flames going even as the sky opened up. They would build fires under rock overhangs or inside cave mouths where wind and rain couldn't reach directly. They kept dry tinder stored in advance, tucked away in the driest nook they could find, almost like an ancient emergency kit. Some groups even used fatty animal materials that burned longer and resisted dampness better than plain wood. Fire wasn't just comfort. It was often the single deciding factor between a rough night and a fatal one. Now here's where things get a bit more human in the emotional sense. Imagine being crammed into a cave with 10 or 20 other people while thunder cracks outside like the sky is trying to communicate something urgent. What do you do with all that nervous energy? You talk. You tell stories. Some researchers believe that extended periods of enforced togetherness, like being stuck inside during storms, may have actually helped strengthen early social bonds and even encourage the development of storytelling itself. Waiting out rain wasn't just downtime. It was potentially one of the earliest forms of forced social bonding, a prehistoric version of a family stuck inside during a power outage, except instead of board games, they had grunts, gestures, early language, and maybe a stick they used to draw pictures in the dirt. Speaking of drawing, some of the most iconic cave art in human history was created in spaces that doubled as rain shelters. Caves like Lascaux and Chauvet weren't just galleries. They were multi-purpose retreats where humans could escape the elements, and some experts suggest bad weather may have given ancient artists extra incentive to sit still long enough to paint intricate images of bison, horses, and long-extinct megafauna. So next time you complain about being bored during a rainy weekend, remember that some ancient human, cooped up in a similar situation, decided to paint an entire wall of galloping horses using charcoal and mineral pigment instead of doom scrolling. Of course, not every storm ended in artistic inspiration. Heavy rain also brought serious danger, and ancient humans had to be constantly aware of threats that modern people rarely think twice about. Flash floods were one of the biggest killers. A dry riverbed could transform into a raging torrent within minutes, catching anyone camped nearby completely off guard. This is part of why so many ancient settlements were positioned on elevated ground or near natural drainage points rather than directly beside water sources, despite water being essential for daily life. It was a constant balancing act between staying close enough to drink and far enough to avoid drowning in your sleep. Lightning posed another very real threat, especially for groups sheltering under tall trees, which might feel like a good idea until you remember trees are essentially nature's lightning rods. Ancient humans likely learned through painful trial and error which types of shelter were safer than others. Losing a family member to a lightning strike would have been a brutal but effective teacher. Over generations, this kind of experiential knowledge became passed down, an early form of survival education long before anyone had a written language to record it. Stories about the dangers of certain trees, certain caves, certain low-lying areas probably circulated as oral warnings, wrapped in whatever early mythology existed at the time. Then there's the mud. Oh, the mud. Rain didn't just fall from the sky and disappear. It transformed entire landscapes into slippery, sticky, occasionally treacherous terrain. Hunting became significantly more dangerous, since tracking animals through slick mud increased the risk of falls, twisted ankles, or worse, especially when pursuing large or aggressive prey. On the flip side, rain also left behind incredibly useful tracking conditions. Fresh mud held footprints beautifully, allowing skilled trackers to follow animal trails with remarkable precision right after a storm passed. So while the rain itself was an obstacle, the aftermath often became a tactical advantage for hunters who knew how to read the ground like a book. Food storage during rainy periods presented its own unique headache. Meat, plant materials, and other perishables needed protection from moisture to avoid spoiling faster than usual. Ancient groups developed methods like smoking meat over fire, which not only preserved it longer, but also helped protect it somewhat from dampness. Storage pits lined with dry grass, bark, or hide served as early pantries, tucked into elevated or sheltered spots specifically chosen to avoid flooding. Losing a food supply to water damage wasn't a minor inconvenience. In lean times, it could mean the difference between surviving the season and not. Clothing, or the ancient equivalent of it, also evolved partly in response to wet weather. Animal hides were stretched, scraped, and sometimes treated with fats or oils to improve water resistance. This wasn't about fashion, obviously, though who's to say some ancient teenager wasn't secretly proud of a particularly water-resistant hide cloak? It was about survival. Staying dry meant staying warm, and staying warm during a cold rain could prevent hypothermia, which was a very real and very fatal risk long before anyone understood the science behind body temperature regulation. Wet skin combined with wind and cold was a lethal combination that ancient communities learned to avoid through layered coverings and smart shelter placement. children during storms presented an entirely different set of challenges. Keeping young ones calm, dry, and safe while adults managed fire, shelter, and food required serious coordination. It's easy to imagine caregivers using early forms of comfort, physical closeness, rhythmic sounds, maybe even simple humming or vocalizations to soothe frightened kids as thunder rattled through the cave. Some anthropologists speculate that these comforting behaviors during stressful weather events might have contributed to the development of lullabies and rhythmic vocal patterns long before actual music existed in any recognizable form. So, in a strange way, a thunderstorm 60,000 years ago might have played a quiet role in shaping the very roots of music itself. Now let's talk about the animals, because ancient humans weren't dealing with rain in isolation. Every creature around them was reacting too, and that mattered enormously. Predators sometimes used storms as cover, since heavy rain masked scent trails and muffled sound, making it easier to approach prey undetected. This meant ancient humans had to remain unusually alert during storms rather than relaxing simply because the weather was rough. A soaked, distracted human sitting near a cave entrance was potentially an easy target for a predator who had just learned that rain equals stealth mode. On the other hand, some herbivores became easier to hunt during or right after storms, since heavy rain often left them cold, sluggish, and less alert, giving skilled hunters a window of opportunity they were quick to exploit. Water collection itself became remarkably efficient during rainstorms. Ancient people didn't need to trek to a river or stream when the sky was doing the job for them. Wide leaves, hollowed logs, natural rock basins, and animal hide pouches were used to catch and store rainwater, sometimes providing a cleaner and more immediate source of drinking water than nearby rivers, which could become murky and contaminated with runoff during heavy storms. In a strange twist, rain was simultaneously a threat and a gift, capable of flooding a camp while also refilling drinking supplies more efficiently than almost any other method available at the time. Illness and hygiene concerns increased significantly during extended wet periods, too. Persistent dampness created ideal conditions for fungal infections, respiratory issues, and general discomfort, especially for groups who couldn't fully dry their hides, clothing, or bedding materials. Skin conditions related to prolonged moisture exposure were likely common, and while ancient humans obviously didn't understand germ theory, they almost certainly noticed patterns between prolonged wetness and illness. This probably reinforced behaviors like drying materials near fires whenever possible and avoiding prolonged exposure to standing water, not because of scientific understanding, but because painful experience taught valuable lessons. Migration decisions were also shaped by seasonal rain patterns in ways that had long-term consequences for entire populations. Some groups followed predictable wet and dry seasons, moving toward areas with reliable water sources during drier months and retreating to higher, more sheltered ground when rainy seasons intensified. This kind of seasonal movement wasn't random wandering. It was a calculated response to environmental patterns observed and remembered across generations, an early form of forecasting based purely on accumulated experience rather than any technology. Entire migration routes across parts of Africa and later into Europe and Asia were likely influenced by these rain-driven survival strategies, shaping not just where people lived, but how far and how often they traveled. There's also something worth appreciating about the psychological side of enduring these storms. Being stuck inside a shelter with nothing to do but wait wasn't just physically challenging, it was mentally taxing too. Boredom, anxiety, and restlessness were almost certainly present, especially during storms that lasted multiple days. Ancient humans likely developed early coping mechanisms, whether through storytelling, communal grooming, simple games involving stones or bones, or just extended periods of rest that our modern lives rarely allow for. In some strange way, ancient humans may have understood the value of forced downtime long before wellness culture turned rest into a marketable concept with candles and essential oils attached to it. Interestingly, evidence suggests some ancient groups developed early symbolic or ritualistic behaviors connected to weather itself. While we can't know exactly what beliefs existed, given the absence of written language, patterns in certain archaeological sites suggest possible ritual behavior tied to environmental events, including storms. It's entirely plausible that early humans developed some form of storm-related mythology. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Perhaps viewing thunder as an angry voice from the sky, or associating heavy rain with supernatural anger or blessing, depending on whether it arrived during a drought or flooded an already soaked camp. These early belief systems, however primitive by later standards, represent some of the first attempts by humans to make sense of forces completely beyond their control. It's also worth mentioning how differently rain would have affected populations depending on where they lived. Groups in tropical regions dealt with frequent, sometimes daily downpours, and developed shelter and lifestyle patterns built around near-constant moisture management. Meanwhile, populations in more temperate or arid regions might have experienced rain as a rarer, more dramatic event, something almost startling when it finally arrived after long, dry stretches. This variation meant there wasn't a single universal ancient response to rain. Instead, there were countless regional adaptations, each shaped by local climate, available materials, and generations of trial and error passed down through observation rather than instruction manuals. One particularly fascinating angle involves tool-making during rainy periods. In forced shelter, time wasn't purely social or restful. It also provided opportunities for detailed, focused craftsmanship. Flint knapping, tool sharpening, and hide preparation all required sustained attention and fine motor skill, tasks that were arguably easier to focus on while stuck inside avoiding rain rather than while actively hunting or foraging outdoors. Some archaeologists believe that periods of forced inactivity due to weather may have actually accelerated technological development, since idle hands stuck in a dry cave had both the time and motivation to experiment with better tool designs. Now, here's a fun little twist most people never consider. Not all reactions to rain were purely practical or survival-focused. There's a strong likelihood that some ancient humans, particularly children, simply enjoyed rain the way kids today jump in puddles. Splashing in fresh puddles, feeling water on skin after a hot, dry stretch, watching raindrops create ripples in a nearby pool. These small moments of simple joy were almost certainly part of the ancient human experience too. Survival pressures were constant, yes, but that doesn't mean every single interaction with rain was purely about danger and hardship. Sometimes rain was just rain, refreshing, playful, and briefly free of consequence. As ancient humans slowly began forming more permanent settlements later in their history, structures started incorporating more deliberate rain management features. Sloped roofing materials, strategically placed drainage channels, and elevated foundations began appearing as communities transitioned from purely nomadic lifestyles toward semi-permanent or fully settled ones. These early architectural choices represent a direct evolutionary line connecting a simple cave shelter used to escape a sudden downpour all the way to the sophisticated rain gutters and waterproof roofing systems we casually take for granted today. Every time modern rain rolls off your roof without soaking your living room, you're witnessing the distant descendant of survival strategies developed by ancient humans huddled under rock overhangs thousands of generations earlier. So what does all of this really tell us? It tells us that rain, something we now mostly experience as a minor scheduling inconvenience, was once a genuinely formidable force shaping nearly every aspect of ancient human life. It influenced where people lived, how they built shelter, what technologies they developed, how they bonded socially, and even possibly how early art, music, and belief systems began to take shape. Every umbrella, raincoat, waterproof boot, and covered parking garage that exists today traces its distant origins back to ancient humans figuring out, through painful trial and plenty of error, how to survive getting rained on without any of the conveniences we now consider basic necessities. Next time a storm rolls through your area and you're annoyed about canceled plans or a slightly damp commute, take a moment to appreciate just how effortless your rainy day actually is. No cave negotiations with a territorial predator required. No worrying about your only fire drowning in a puddle. No frantic scramble to save food stores from flooding. Just a warm, dry space, modern technology, and maybe a cup of something hot while the rain does its thing outside a window that keeps it firmly on the other side of the glass. Ancient humans didn't have that luxury, yet they adapted, survived, and ultimately thrived despite every storm nature threw at them.